So, hey guys, welcome back. So, in this video, we will be discussing about what is the Jenkins architecture and how is it implemented in the real-time scenarios. This is also one of the famous interview questions, and one of the questions they start off with is by asking what is explain your uh, Jenkins architecture at your company. So, let's get into it. When we start off learning the Jenkins, we usually install the Jenkins as a single node architecture. Meaning, so once we launch a remote VM, let's say an EC2 instance, so in that EC2 instance, we will be installing the Jenkins. We'll also be creating a CI/CD pipeline, and then we'll be building the artifacts and storing the artifacts as well. So everything is done in a single node. That is good for learning and testing purpose, but there are some major drawbacks when it comes to this architecture. This cannot be used in this single node Jenkins architecture cannot be used in real time scenarios. For example, if you are handling a large project, that is not possible, because always remember, as a rule of thumb, a single point of contact is a single point of failure. So in order to avoid that, we need to create a distributed architecture for Jenkins, where it has certain master nodes and it also has certain worker nodes. So let's discuss that. So this is the overview of the Jenkins distributed architecture. So here we have a single Jenkins master node, and that Jenkins master node is connected with several worker nodes. Basically, Jenkins master node is used to schedule and distribute the jobs to be executed in the worker nodes. So Jenkins master basically scans for code changes from the GitHub repository, and once it gets alerted with the code change, it is going to take that particular code, schedule the CI/CD builds, and those builds will be scheduled and executed on that particular assigned worker node. So that is the job of the Jenkins master. So again, when it comes to Jenkins worker, it's quite simple and straightforward. It carries out the build jobs which are assigned by the Jenkins master. So this is the overview of the Jenkins distributed architecture. So now let's discuss why we are using Jenkins distributed architecture. So for example, in the real-time scenarios, we if you consider an application code base, that application code base will have multiple branch. So in order to for example, the multiple branch might support like some goes for testing, some goes for the separate features of the application, some goes for the maintenance, and so on. So if we take the entire remote GitHub repository of the project, that project will have multiple branches apart from the main branch, which is for the production code base. So we'll not touch the main branch. So if we consider other branches, each branch will have their own specific purpose. So once each branch is committed with their own code base, usually what happens is that each code branch will have their own Jenkins file. So once that particular branch is committed with the code along with its updated Jenkins file, what Jenkins master does is that it is going to take the code along with that particular Jenkins file. It is going to scan for code changes, and using that template of that Jenkins file, it is going to execute the CI/CD of that particular branch. So this is known as distributed builds. So in order to support the distributed builds in real-time scenarios, there will be multiple distributed builds for each branches, and there will be many branches for the project. So in order to accommodate so many builds at the same time, what we do is that we will for the Jenkins master takes those multiple builds, and it's going to queue in the certain worker nodes of that particular build job type. So once that happens, it is going to execute multiple builds across workers parallelly. So this improves the efficiency. This also improves the time when it comes to like executions of work jobs. If there is any bugs or if there is any errors, it's going to let us know at the earliest, so that those things can be rectified. So this is one of the main use cases of implementing the distributed master worker architecture. And also, as I mentioned before, it is going to handle heavy workloads, meaning heavy like multiple build jobs across the distributed builds for that particular application Git repository. And yeah, so that's one of the main reasons like why we are using the Jenkins architecture. So in the coming videos, what I'll be doing is that I will be implementing the Jenkins distributed architecture in the AWS VPC. So how am I doing it? So as you can see in this diagram depicts the overall view of how the Jenkins distributed architecture will be once it is deployed in the cloud. Here I'm choosing AWS Cloud. So before deploying not just distributed Jenkins, before deploying anything for that matter, we need to have the VPC and its subcomponents in place first. First, creating VPC is very essential for any components or any resources to be deployed. So that is the first rule. So we're going to create the VPC first with its appropriate CIDR, the CIDR, the CIDR range. And once we have the CIDR, we of that VPC, we will be creating the public subnets and the private subnets. So in the public subnet, we will be deploying the NAT gateway and the bastion host. The purpose of NAT gateway is to connect the instances in the private zone, so that the instance in the private zone can have access to internet in one-way direction, so that if it wants to download any packages, it will go ahead, or if it wants to update something, it's going to go ahead and do it. So that is the purpose of NAT gateway. The bastion host, which is there in the public subnet, is used to SSH into the instances or inside the private subnet, because as we all know that the resources in the private subnet cannot be accessed from the internet because it is in a separate private network. So in order for the instances to be accessed, what we'll be doing is that we'll be using the SSH protocol to access those private instances from the public instance, from the public subnet's bastion host, which is another EC2 instance. So this is about the public subnets. In the private subnets, we will be deploying all the Jenkins instances, including the masters and the worker nodes inside the private subnet, because since it is a real-time Jenkins distributed architecture to handle the company's high-end business projects, it has to be in a private subnet, because you don't want other people out of this project to access your Jenkins instances. That's going to be very messy, and that's a high security concern as well. So we don't want that. So for those reasons, we will be deploying it in the private subnet. So in the private subnet, what we'll be doing is that we will be creating one or two Jenkins master node, and also we will be creating we'll be scaling the worker nodes through auto scaling group of the AWS VPC. And the way okay, so before that, I also want to say that the machines, the AMI machine images for Jenkins master and the worker nodes will be created through an open source tool known as Packer. So in the next video, I will be discussing what is Packer, why Packer is used, and how Packer is used to create the immutable infrastructure. and we'll kick off creating the immutable infrastructure using the Jenkins master and worker nodes. So that is in the next video. So over here, what I'm trying to say is that uh, so we have the multiple worker nodes which can be automatically scaled, uh, because those worker nodes are deployed under the auto scaling group across both the private subnets. So in order to access, so once we have the Jenkins master which is connected to the worker nodes, the Jenkins master node will be assigning the build jobs to those worker nodes, and the worker nodes are going to execute it. In order to access the Jenkins um, master node dashboard, since it is in a private subnet, it cannot be accessed directly. Even with a bastion host SSH, it cannot be, the dashboard cannot be accessed basically. Since that's the problem, what we are going to do is that we are going to create a public facing load balancer, and we'll be assigning that to the Jenkins master node, so that and it's going to be only one way communication from the load balancer to the master, and the master is going to output the data towards the load balancer. So with this load balancer, we will be able to see what exactly is happening in the Jenkins master through its dashboard. So once we have this basic components, we will be creating the VPC, and then we'll be creating the Jenkins master and worker machine images via Packer, and then we'll be using the Groovy scripts to automate the Jenkins deployments. And once the entire deployment is finished within the AWS VPC, we'll have a ready to go working distributed Jenkins architecture at production scale. So let's get right into it.